I have to go back to this statement that Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner made in response to the looting in Philly over the last week. And it was more than just looting. You had that social justice warrior who was killed in his own, murdered in his own apartment after ridiculing people who suggested that Philly was being besieged by violent predators.
Yeah, he was shot 7 times.
New York, too, by the way. Another couple of social justice warriors. The guy that was walking in Brooklyn with his girlfriend got stabbed to death by a sort of deranged, maybe homeless woman. This dude, self-described Antifa. His girlfriend on social media, self-described defund the policer, pushing BLM.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get mugged by reality anymore.
Sometimes you get killed by reality.
Well, yeah.
Well, you do. It's sad, and we're not gloating or saying like, "Oh, we told you so," but this is just the facts and the reality that we live in.
Yeah, and
I was a Democrat too, but I was mugged by reality.
And $73,000 in crabs were stolen in Philly yesterday.
You know what? I think you want a crab cake out of this.
That's a lot of crabs. It's a lot of crab meat.
It's making you hungry.
Well, here's what Larry Krasner had to say when queried about all of the lawlessness, of course, caught on security footage that then makes its way around the interweb. Here's what he said. Listen to this phrase, because this is one that I think you're going to hear again and again. Add to your Orwellian dictionary for the times.
Not going to let any judge disturb the peace of this city.
The DA calls it individual justice and says everyone involved in the looting will be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
We'll look carefully to see whether this is a one-off situation and they're fundamentally law-abiding people.
Fundamentally law-abiding people.
Fundamentally law-abiding criminals. There's two sets of criminals, the ones that are fundamentally law-abiding and the ones that are not, I guess. Okay. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Charles Lehman. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, working primarily on the Policing and Public Safety Initiative and a contributing editor of City Journal. He's done a bit of an examination of the consent decree that under which the Chicago Police Department operates that hamstrings police, in addition to how they're hamstrung by the political leadership of the city. The consent decree implemented in 2019. Well, he asks a pertinent question. So how's it going? 4 years in, what's the impact?
Well,
Charles, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on the show again. So as you alluded to, I took a look at the consent decree. Obviously, it's been a subject of some dispute in the city. But, I think ultimately when you're trying to evaluate a program like a police consent decree, you have to be interested in what are the outcomes. And what I find across the board is there's actually been surprisingly little change in most of the outcomes that we would have expected the consent decree to affect. In some senses, that's good. So across a variety of measures, officer-involved shootings have basically continued to decline at the same trajectory, or they've leveled off at the same trajectory they were going at when the consent decree was implemented. That's probably good, but not much of a change. Use of force seems to be slightly down, but that probably reflects COVID changes. Rates of complaints are actually slightly up, but that may be have to do with measurement as well. The thing that's most telling to me is the city has been asking Chicagoans on a monthly basis how safe they feel and how much trust they have in the police since November of 2017. And what I find looking at those data is there's been basically no change in their sense of trust in the CPD. So insofar as the goal was to restore trust in CPD, there has been no change in that level.
Yeah, well, and so Larry Snelling, the newly minted Chicago police superintendent, this may be an early test for him. If I'm him and I read this piece, your assessment, if I agree with it, then wouldn't I say it's time to lift the consent decree and focus on what the real problem is in Chicago, which is the lack of arrests, because in part for all sorts of reasons, including lack of police resources, lack of prosecution, lack of proper sentencing by judges. We need to focus on the thing that has people feeling unsafe, which is repeat violent offenders operating on Chicago streets. That seems like this could be an early moment for Snelling in his tenure as police chief.
Yeah, when I those two priorities that I alluded to earlier, concerns about safety and concerns about trust, really have to be balanced. They both have to be incorporated. So I think it is right. Chicago has a persistently high violent crime rate for decades by comparison to other cities. B, a particularly acute violent crime problem right now, which I agree is not being helped by the county and the state legislature. And so I think reprioritizing towards that would be beneficial. If you have scarce dollars, it's better to spend on that. On the other hand, it is clear, it does seem like a substantial portion of Chicago trusts CPD less than they ideally would. And that's going to be a persistent problem for crime control, among many other things. And so, I think the question has to be, it isn't, should CPD try to do nothing to change itself? It's just, is the consent decree the best tool for affecting that change? It seems, at least as far, like the answer is no.
Well, right, but one of the perception problems CPD has, I mean, some of it is high profile bad actors and cases, the Laquan McDonald case, but the other is just the constant unwarranted demonization of police by politicians for political reasons.
Yes, I think that's almost certainly right. And ideally having a chief executive who's supportive of the police would help
Yeah,
Larry Snelling. I'm not sure you
be,
have that in Chicago,
it'd be
but
novel. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But in my from my perspective as a researcher, my question is very narrow: is the consent decree process? Look, many cities have implemented these consent decrees. They're extremely popular during the Obama administration. The Biden administration has sought to bring them back. And the question to me is, in large part, are these an effective tool for police reform? Do they actually work? Chicago's the largest PD in the nation to undergo a consent decree. And if it's not particularly impactful in Chicago, then we should be willing to ask the question of, are the feds the right agency, the right agent to get involved in doing this? Is the consent decree process the right process to make this happen?
Well,
Is there a way to investigate, to get other stakeholders involved, to try to do some reconciliation between the police and those leaders who, as you're alluding to, would rather take advantage of them for political purposes than see safer streets?
well, has anything positive come out of Chicago's police consent decree
You
in your
know,
research?
there are jurisdictions where the consent decree made things appreciably worse. In Pittsburgh, there was a dramatic increase in use of force following the consent decree, and that basically has not happened. It's also the case that uh, there were possibly some beneficial changes that happened in the wake of the protests and changes made under Mayor Manuel starting in 2015. Um, well, one can argue about what the ideal level of police officer involved shootings is. It's declined pretty substantially since 2015. That seems generically like a good thing, although maybe there were shots that should have been taken that weren't. Um, that said, that's hard to attribute to the consent decree rather than the prevailing environment. And we should note that there's actually high quality research that says that prevailing environment contributed substantially to the increase in violent crime in Chicago following 2015.
You write too about the cost of implementing under our previous mayor. The prediction was the implementation of this consent decree would cost 50 to 100 million, and this is in part a lot of spend on independent monitoring that teams that are tasked with overseeing implementation. And you write, it's hard to justify spending that much money on a process that doesn't seem to be having the desired effect, especially when we need all that money for the migrants. Yeah. So that's the real. I mean that part of it's the issue of the spend, and part of it is just the issue of look. This is just not accomplishing anything in particular except for politicians to point to say, I was a proponent of police reform. We're bringing these independent teams. They're providing this oversight. I mean, this is the discussion, the pertinent discussion in cities beset with endemic violent crime is about police protocols, like chase policies, what prosecutors and judges are doing, how the three different agencies in criminal justice systems are working together. I mean, that's the conversation we should be having. This is all just window dressing bull jive, isn't it?
Well, I think, yeah, and what you're saying with the independent monitoring team is important here, right? And this happens in consent decrees across the country. A court orders a consent decree for a local PD. They appoint an outside agent to oversee the implementation of the decree. The outside agent gets paid. The funding that goes to them is on the order of millions of dollars every single year that comes out of the city's coffers. That's a pretty cherry gig. So it's not just, that it's not doing anything. I agree. It's also that that funding is going towards not just being wasted, but going towards an entity that has an interest in perpetuating its own existence. That is going to want to keep saying things are getting worse, things are getting worse. You need me here. Look, the consent decree isn't working. You need me to continue to implement the consent decree because that's how you get paid as an independent monitor. And you see this. You saw this in Seattle. You saw this. You've seen this in lots of places that have implemented consent decrees. Occasionally, you get a good one. I don't know strong opinions on the merits here, but in general, there's a real risk involved in these positions. There's real benefit to be gained from being in this position.
Yeah, excellent point. Charles Lehman, fellow at the Manhattan Institute, working primarily on the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, also contributing editor at City Journal. Charles, thanks as always.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank.